Hey, everybody, and welcome to episode 7 of Limited Principles, your weekly limited podcast for Magic the Gathering that looks at the Pack One Pick Ones of a new format and also the staple cards, the cornerstones of Limited throughout several formats. And today will be our last Staples episode before the new Hobbit release. This is pre-release weekend coming out, and this is going to be my first episode recorded on the road. I'm on vacation here in northern Minnesota, and so forgive a little bit of the sound quality, making some adjustments here to be able to record this for you going into pre-release weekend this weekend. And so hopefully this will give you one more card to prepare for your pre-release events. And then next week we'll be going into Pack One Pick Ones from The Hobbit. So today we're talking about Murder, the card, 1 black, instant card that destroys target creature that has its roots all the way back to the very beginnings of Magic. Actually wasn't by the same name and had a slightly different effect then, but that card in this upcoming Hobbit format is Bilbo's Deadly Slice. And the card that we just saw that is the Murder equivalent from Marvel Superheroes was Hour of Defeat. So you might have heard people say, oh, that's just Murder. It's a common black staple that destroys target creature, basically is what's being talked about with Murder. You can see Murder there on the right side. Murder is typically a 1 black instant destroy target creature. We'll look at its history in a little bit. But in Marvel Superheroes, it was Hour of Defeat, 3 and a black instant. Still common. We're trying to compare apples to apples here. So we're looking at instant, common, black, destroy target creature, basically. You're going to see some variants today, but Hour of Defeat was 3 and a black instant in Marvel Superheroes, destroy target creature and surveil 1. So it removed the double black pip requirement, added an additional mana, still instant, still destroy target creature, and what you got for that extra mana was a little bit of flexibility because obviously 3 and a black is much more splashable than 1 black is, and you also got surveil 1. So we have a different cost there. A big thing about Hour of Defeat was that it was easier to splash, and that was very important in Marvel Superheroes because there were lots of times that removal was drying up in the draft, and yet removal of big threats was a major consideration in Marvel Superheroes. So especially as the format went on, a lot of times you were splashing a third color for removal specifically, and black was one of the great candidates for that because, as usual, in limited formats, black and Marvel Superheroes had an assortment of different removal spell options. So Hour Defeat's performance in Marvel Superheroes was very good. It made every deck better in a format that needed answers. Didn't matter what color you paired black together with, didn't matter whether you were splashing or not. Your deck got better by including Hour of Defeat. Now, this data doesn't really tell us what happened when you took it in numbers. There was definitely cheaper and more efficient removal. In particular, Cruel Alliance was a 2 and a black common that exiled target creature, and you had the potential to use the teamwork mechanic to give you some life gain as well. And that was a great removal spell. Definitely better than Hour of Defeat, but you weren't necessarily going to see a ton of those at the table because as the format went on, people learned how good Cruel Alliance was. And Hour of Defeat costing 1 more made it possibly more consistent from a splash standpoint because you didn't have to be casting it on turn 3. You could wait to cast it until turn 4 or later, obviously. So Cruel Alliance was a better removal spell. So was Dark Deed. That was the 1 and a black instant, -4/-4. But that was uncommon, and so you were going to see that even less than you were going to see copies of Cruel Alliance. And Widow's Bite was the 1 and a black instant that was cheaper, only cost 2. It had the 2 modes of giving target creature death touch or target creature -2/-2 until end of turn. You could only get both modes if you cast it with Teamwork 3, tapped 3 power worth of creatures or more. And the -2/-2, there were definitely creatures that didn't hit. And so Widow's Bite performed worse than Hour of Defeat did. But it definitely had its place as a cheap removal spell. So the point being here that Hour of Defeat definitely had a place in Marvel superheroes in the removal suite. It functioned just fine and made the decks that it was in better. So let's talk now about the OG Murder card and its history. Murder was the advent of black unconditional removal at common. From the very beginning of Magic, going all the way back to the Alpha set in 1993, we had Terror, that was 1 and a black, destroy target creature without possibility of regeneration. That mechanic, older mechanic, obviously. But it did not affect black and artifact creatures. So you had limitations. It cost 1 less black mana than Murder did, but it had limitations. And then you also saw Doomblade come out in 2010. That was a 1 and a black instant, destroy target non-black creature. So now we could affect artifact creatures, but we still couldn't affect black creatures. So we're starting to remove some limitations. And then Murder finally came out in M13 in 2012, and it was 1 black, destroy target creature as an instant. So we added 1 black mana to the requirements for casting, but we removed all limitations to the card. It just destroyed a creature. Didn't matter whether it was black, artifact, whatever, it destroyed it. And that card in M13 was a first pickable card in Draft. It was premium removal that had not been seen in Magic before, and especially in a much older, slower format back in M13, when boards would get gummed up a lot more than they do in Modern Limited, and people were not curving out to win it by turn 6 generally. Having removal that was unconditional and could target their best target was really, really good. Murder was was reprinted at Uncommon in Eldritch Moon in 2016 and in M19 in 2019. There were a couple other common prints in there, but what I want to emphasize here in Murder's history was that it was first launched as a common, but then it was so powerful when it came out that there was experimentation with, should this be uncommon? Should this be common? There was kind of a bouncing back and forth, and it was not for a while, several years, before Murder became a consistent staple at common. And since that time, since 2019, the last time we saw Murder printed at Uncommon, we've seen tweaking to Murder's design. And there's been so much tweaking to the design that it's created entirely new templates for the idea behind Murder, like unconditional removal. In particular, we have like the Bone Splinters variant, the like single black mana to destroy or exile target creature, depending on the variant. But you have to sacrifice like a creature or an artifact in order to do that. Sometimes there's a discard the card version. Sometimes you don't have to pay something extra, or you don't have to sacrifice or discard, but you have to pay 4 additional mana. So it costs 5 and it's expensive. That's just one example of a variant of Murder that has come out of this tweaking of the Murder card, tweaking its cost, tweaking its requirements, destroy versus exile. So like, for example, in Time Spiral Remastered in 2020, you saw Strangling Soul, the 2 and a black instant, destroy target creature with toughness 3 or less, and then it had flashback. So we're starting to restrict Murder again. It was 2 and a black instead of 1 black, so it was easier to cast, but we couldn't destroy big creatures. So there was a tweaking to Murder to like, well, we can make it cheaper, but it can only destroy little stuff. In original Strixhaven in 2021, we saw Mage Hunter's Onslaught, which was 2 black for a sorcery. So tweak it with sorcery speed and an additional mana in addition to the double black pip. Destroy target creature or planeswalker, so we added a type. And whenever a creature blocks his turn, its controller loses 1 life. So some levers are being pulled there, right? An additional mana, sorcery speed, but we're going to add the planeswalker type. And there's, especially in limited, there are not a lot of things that kill planeswalkers. So that was important. And then, give it a little bit of extra value if you're attacking this turn. You attack into their board and you kill their biggest thing to enable an attack. And then if creatures block, their opponent kind of gets punished for blocking. In Kamigawa Neon Dynasty in 2022, we had Twisted Embrace. That's the 2 black enchantment. So we're playing with card type now. It's not an instant or a sorcery. It's an enchantment, which means it's itself a permanent coming onto the battlefield, which means it can be found by cards that find permanents, obviously. Enchant artifact or creature you control. That also meant that you had some blowout possibility if your opponent had instant speed removal for your artifact or creature. So there's additional considerations, of course, with that kind of a card. It also was 2 black, the additional mana, but when it entered the battlefield, destroy target creature or a planeswalker again, and then enchanted permanent gets +1/+1 if it's a creature. So it becomes a piece of cardboard that sticks on the battlefield, has some lasting value, becomes an aura, basically. And so you can see that some of the tweaking to Murder's design. And then we did get strictly better versions. In Lord of the Rings in 2023, we got Claim the Precious, 1 black, sorcery. So I guess you can't say strictly better. It was not instant speed. I really shouldn't have said strictly better there on the slide, I guess. But destroy target creature and the ring tempts you. So the exchange is lose instant speed for sorcery, but the ring tempts you, which was like a key mechanic to Lord of the Rings. Claim the Precious performed great. It was a good card in that format. And before we get on to looking at the different variants of Murder that we've had in Modern Limited, all the standard legal sets, this is a chance for me to ask you to subscribe, like, comment, help support the podcast. Love for you to subscribe on YouTube at Limited Principles. Join me on Twitter or X at limited_P1P1 and on Blue Sky at limitedprinciples.bsky.social. And if you'd like to buy me a coffee, help support the podcast monetarily, feel free to do that. There's a QR code here on the slide, or you can go to buymeacoffee.com/limitedprinciples. Moving on then to the standard legal Murder variants, starting with the oldest set first, as we typically do. So in Wilds of Eldraine, we had Shatter the Oath. It was a C+ level card. Murder is generally a C level card. You'll see that come up in the sets where literally the Murder card was reprinted. But Shatter the Oath was slightly better at the C+ level. It was good everywhere in Wilds of Eldraine except Black-Red. If you remember in Wilds of Eldraine, Black-Red wanted to have a lot of rat synergy cards and was kind of a go-wide strategy. It wanted to win fast. It wanted to fill the board with rats and attack you and use anthem effects and things. And it played well with Bargain because you could just sacrifice rats all over the place and get extra effects. But Shatter the Oath was 3 black, so 2 additional mana than Murder. It was a sorcery, so you're already saying, wow, that it costs 2 more and it's worse speed. It was destroy target creature or enchantment, and Wilds of Eldraine was all about enchantments, and there were some very powerful ones, although most of the time you'd still want to destroy target creature because there were a lot of trinkety enchantments that you didn't want to destroy in Wilds of Eldraine. But Shatter the Oath came with an additional piece of cardboard. It created a Wicked Roll token attached to up to 1 target creature you control, which means it gave the enchanted creature +1/+1, and then when that Wicked Roll went to the graveyard, each opponent loses 1 life. An additional piece of cardboard that buffed one of your creatures. So remove one of their things, buff one of your things, make it easier to attack. There's some life loss for your opponent coming later. Shatter the Oath. So the biggest thing to say about this card is even though it costs 2 more than Murder, and even though it was sorcery speed rather than instant, this still performs slightly better than Murder. That's how important that additional piece of cardboard, the Wicked Roll, was, and a little bit the added targetable type in enchantment, but it was mainly the Wicked Roll. Moving on to Lost Caverns of Ixalan, we had Join the Dead. That was a C-level card, performed basically the same as Murder typically does. It was almost unconditional because it was 1 black for an instant. Target creature gets -5 until end of turn. So instead of just destroy target creature, gave -5. That inspired some different play patterns. You could do some shenanigans with Join the Dead that you couldn't with Murder. Like if you had a big creature and they played some removal spell that said destroy something with, power 4 or greater or something like that, you could say, haha, my creature is only a 2/2 until end of turn. And that was in a format with lots of big dinosaurs, so there were lots of big things that opponents would want to target with their removal. And then it also had Descend 4, so you gave -10 until end of turn instead if there were 4 or more permanent cards in your graveyard. And at that point, it was basically unconditional. -10 killed basically everything. So that was a variant where they tried to get away from the words destroy target creature, but that was basically filling the role of Murder in Lost Caverns of Ixalan. In Murders at Karlov Manor, we had Murder. So we have Murder being reprinted in a few of these sets that are still legal and standard. And I want you to pay attention to them so that you can see how they performed in each of those formats. Like, can we see a consistent pattern in where Murder lands in its role in a format? Murder was a sea-level card in Murders at Karlov Manor. It was best in black, green, and blue-black. That shouldn't be all that surprising. Those tend to be grindier color pairs in most limited sets. And so playing a small game, kind of an attrition-y game, and being able to kill off your opponent's stuff and last till the late game where black, green, and blue-black often shine is unsurprising. It was still playable in the aggressive white and red pairings. Murders at Karlov Manor tended aggressive, and things like white, black, red, black, those color pairs tended to be pretty aggressive. But because Murder was best in black, green, and blue, black, what it did is it helped those color pairs compete with the faster decks. And as you can see here, if you're watching on video, or I'll describe to you, it was not an overrated card. It was not an underrated card. The drafting community treated Murder exactly where it should be. It was the 9th highest drafted common and the 10th performing common out of 89 cards, and it was the second highest. That I don't know why that says green common there. It should say black common. That's a 17 lands error. It was the second highest drafted black common and the third highest performing black common. In Outlaws of Thunder Junction, we did have Murder actually printed in Outlaws. I'm not considering it here because it was on the bonus sheet kind of for Outlaws. If you remember the wanted poster cards, there was Murder was printed there, but it occurred with less frequency than other commons. So I'm only going to consider here Consuming Ashes, which was a 2 black instant, so 1 mana more expensive than Murder. And it changed the word destroy to exile. And it also had the text, if it had mana value 3 or less, surveil 2. So you had an interesting payoff if you were forced to use this slightly more expensive version of Murder on a cheap creature. If your opponent was curving out and you needed to keep up, especially if you're on the draw, you got paid for using, for example, going down mana, like using this on like a 2-drop or a 3-drop as a 4-mana spell. You surveilled 2, so you got to set up your next draws. And that was enough to push the card, despite being 1 mana more expensive, to the B- level. Exile plus optional Surveil was worth the extra mana. So 1 more mana, but Exile plus Surveil 2 was nice. This ended up being the second best common in the entire set of Outlaws, second best out of 91 cards. And if you remember Outlaws, green was pretty much the best color in that format. There were a lot of big green creatures, and so your ability to remove those big green creatures was extra important. You had to have something to deal with the unconditional removal, and exiling meant that there was no chance of getting them back through any graveyard retrieval. And it was the first best black common, unsurprisingly, beating the second best common in the set. Bloomburrow had 2 murder variants, Nocturnal Hunger and Early Winter. And this is a really interesting comparison of what kinds of levers that Wizards pulls with murder tend to benefit the player and which ones tend to hurt. So Nocturnal Hunger was slightly cheaper. I shouldn't say cheaper. It was slightly more flexible to cast because it was 2 and a black rather than 1 black. And Early Winter was more expensive. It was 4 and a black. So neither one required a double black pip. But Nocturnal Hunger, 2 and a black instant, destroy target creature, but you had to gift a food. So if you paid 2 and a black, you could destroy target creature, but you had to give your opponent a food. And that wasn't nothing. There were food synergies in Bloomburrow, and you're basically gifting your opponent 3 life at the cost of 2 mana, obviously. But you're helping keep your opponent alive when often destroying their creature was hoping that you could attack through. Now, if you weren't swinging for lethal on that turn, then that meant that your opponent would have time potentially to crack the food. But you had an out. You didn't have to promise the gift, because the card said if the gift wasn't promised, you lose 2 life. So you could just decide, I'm going to cast a slightly more flexible version of murder and lose 2 life, which is something a player in black is often willing to pay. We have cards often that say, like, pay 3 mana, draw 2 cards, and lose 2 life. Or draw two cards. So it was easier to cast, but choose your cost. But you got to choose the cost. You got to choose whether you wanted to give your opponent an object that they could pay to give themselves life, or whether you wanted to lose life. So you could basically weigh that off the game condition. And the net result was that Nocturnal Hunger was a C+ card. In other words, it was not more of a detriment to have the gift of food or the lose 2 life than it was to have the flexibility of 2 and a black. I mean, that meant the card was very easily castable on turn 3, for example, where often murder is not castable on turn 3 because you have to have 2 black sources down already, and you won't always. So the 2 and a black versus 1 black difference is pretty big in Limited, because as we are more and more into the modern game, you have to be able to address fast starts. And you have to make sure that your removal spells are not clunky. You need them to be flexible and castable on curve if necessary. Early Winter was 4 and a black for an instant. Choose 1, exile target creature, or target opponent exiles an enchantment they control. They got to pick the enchantment. So what were you getting for your 2 additional mana? You were either exiling instead of destroying, or... So what were you getting for your 2 additional mana? You were either exiling instead of destroying, or the option of having your opponent exile an enchantment they control. And that was not worth it. It was D+ for Early Winter, and this is the only card you are going to see in the rundown today that was at the D level. That's how much worse it was. So it was an experiment, and it was a failed experiment. I would be really interested to see if Wizards ever prints a card like Early Winter that's 3 and a black with that kind of optionality. I suspect that will be a viable card, and at least as viable as murder if that's done. You're going to see a card later that's 3 and a black for an instant that's just exile target creature, where they removed the option, but they also removed one additional mana, and you'll notice that it performed just fine. So 2 and a black, gift of food or lose 2 life actually improved the card. 4 and a black, and the exile optionality made the card significantly worse. Okay, Duskmourn, just like Murders at Karlov Manor, the kind of murder mystery haunted house sets both had murder as a card, as its namesake there. Murder was again a C-level card here. Like Murders, it was best in black, green, and blue, black. It was actually okay in black, red, sacrifice. In Duskmourn, the Mardu colors, white, black, red, were not playing super aggressive games like they were in Murders. Black, red was playing kind of a grindy sacrifice game. And White-Black was playing Reanimator in Duskmourn, wanted to reanimate these huge things. And if any of you remember Shroud Stomper from Duskmourn, that was kind of a fixture card of that strategy. And so Murder still worked in White-Black because it extended the game. And if you played attrition-y, like kill each other's stuff goes in the graveyard, well, you were just going to reanimate yours anyway. And so that ended up just fine. So played as a C-level card, perfectly good staple card for your deck. Was playable everywhere and made several decks quite a bit better. It was, by the way, among black commons, the highest drafted black common, performed as the third best black common. You'll see that Murder is typically slightly overrated. If you look at 17 lands data for it, it's usually overrated. It's usually picked higher than it needs to be, which simply means you probably don't need to be first picking Murder-like cards in drafts. You can let them go a little later and let other people fight over them and be a little bit more preferential. But some drafts, you just get to the point where removal has been thin, and you have to take some, and then you're not going to be embarrassed to play Murder. It's fine. It's a good stock, kind of average removal spell. All right, foundations. We had Bake into a Pie. 2 black, 1 mana more than Murder. For an instant, destroy target creature, create a food token. We get another piece of cardboard, and it's a piece of cardboard that gains us life. And that raised Bake into a Pie into a B-level card. So 1 additional mana for a food token, totally worth it. Even though you have to pay 2 to crack the food later. You're getting an additional object. Bake into a Pie was the top common in Foundations, number 1 out of 91. That's how strong that was. B-level card. So additional cardboard and additional cardboard that gives you life gain. Very good. We move on to Ether Drift, and we had Spin Out, which was 1 black instant, destroy target creature or a vehicle. Now this is strictly better than Murder because you add the text or vehicle. And so you're adding a mode that hit a focal, plentiful card type in Ether Drift. Ether Drift was all about vehicles. There were vehicles everywhere. Far more vehicles, and far more vehicles were being played. And obviously, when vehicles aren't being crewed, then they're not creatures, so they can't be targeted by Murder normally. But this allowed you to hit vehicles that maybe were giving some kind of ongoing static value, or were never or rarely going to be crewed. I mean, the fact that Murder is at instant speed means that you could potentially target your opponent's vehicle when they crew it, and then instant speed respond to that. But here you could target basically vehicles whether they had been crewed to become creatures or not. And that raised Spin Out to a B- level card, so 2 grades above where Murder normally lands. Made every deck it was in better. It was the 9th best common in the whole set out of 93 cards. Very, very good. But one of the problems was, and I think that some of this is like residual response by players to the previous set. So Foundations comes out. Bake into a Pie is amazing. It's the number 1 common in the whole set. And then what's the result? We get to Ether Drift, the next set, and Spin Out was the number 1 most highly drafted common in Ether Drift. It was the 9th best common, but it was the number 1 highest drafted common. So it's something to watch for. Like, look at the Murder variant in the previous set. See how it did. If it was like average-ish, not that great, and then you see a version coming in the next set that, based on like research in this podcast you're listening to or watching today, if you suspect that the next version coming out is going to be stronger, expect that version to be underdrafted. Or if you have something like we see here, like Foundations had Bake into a Pie, it was amazing, it was the top common in the set, and then you get a version coming in the next set unless you think that card is at least as good as the one that came before, expect it to be overdrafted. That helps you prepare for, like, am I going to see this card again in the draft? Do I want other players to take this a little bit too highly so that I can get other great cards, pick up some of the good rares and uncommons while they draft top level commons a little bit too highly? Tarkir Dragonstorm, we had Dragon's Prey, which was 2 and a black instant, so same cost, 3 mana, but did not require double pip. And this had really interesting design. Dragon's Prey costs 2 more if it targets a dragon, destroy target creature. So slightly more flexible murder, but would cost 4 and a black if you targeted a dragon. So it played like murder. It was a C-level card, like performed exactly like murder does, but it was an absolute flavor and mechanical win on multiple levels. First of all, Dragon's Prey, like the idea is the dragon is killing something. And if the dragon kills something, it costs basically what murder does, 2 and a black, 3 mana, right? But if you target a dragon, it costs 2 more. So it's harder to kill dragons because they're big, nasty beasts, right? Harder to kill them. And also what that did is, in a set that was all about dragons, it allowed dragons to stick around the board more often than they normally would if there was just a normal copy of murder running around. And this is the only murder variant we're looking at today that performed better in splash decks than in non-splash decks. It made 2-color decks worse, and it made splash decks better. And one of the reasons for that is that Tarkir Dragonstorm had 2 basic deck types. It had like a Mardu-ish, like white, black, red, aggressive deck that had a whole bunch of little stuff, which meant if you cast Dragon's Prey, even for 3, you were probably trading down on mana. You were almost never trading up because it was just little stuff, and fill the board and make it go wide. And also, the other kind of deck was a dragon. What was a Dragon Globe Orb? I always get the name of that wrong, but anyway, the Dragon Orb that allowed you to pump out dragons and make them bigger when they came out, and then play a bunch of big dragons, and it was like a green X kind of multicolored dragons deck. So where did it perform better? Even if you were targeting a dragon and paying 5, like the dragon was often one of the best cards you were going to see from your opponent. And so having this card in your deck allowed you to answer the mirror. You wanted this card in your deck more if you were playing the dragon deck yourself. Like, I don't care that it's your little thing. I'll kill it, and my creatures are eventually going to be bigger than yours. And Dragon's Prey, again, still somewhat overrated, though. It was the 3rd highest rated common, or the highest drafted common, and the 31st rated common. It performed fine. It was a C-level card, but it was drafted way too high. Way too high. People saw the cheap cost and they were like, ooh, I'm going to take this. And then, funny enough, Dragon's decks were really good in Dragonstorm. Final Fantasy, we had Sephiroth's Intervention. 3 and a black, again, 1 additional mana, but slightly more flexible against the double black. 3 and a black instant, destroy target creature, you gain 2 life. What, that's all I get for my 1 mana is gain 2 life? Well, let's think back to Bacon to a Pie. That was 2 black. It was harder to cast than 3 and a black. And it created a food. It did create another object, but then you didn't gain the life right away, right? You had to pay 2 to crack the food to gain 3 life later. Meanwhile, Sephiroth's Intervention, you just gain the life right when you cast a card. Incidental life gain made this a B-level card. It performed exactly the same as Bacon to a Pie did. Definitely worth the extra mana. It made every deck it was in better. It was the number 1 black common, the number 5 common in the whole set. Very good. It was drafted as the number 1 common. It was the number 1 most drafted common, but that wasn't too much of an overreach for this card. It was really, really good. Edge of Eternities, we had Gravkill, and this is the card I was talking about before, where a very simple murder variant, 3 and a black instant, exile target creature, or spacecraft. So 3 and a black exile, add the spacecraft type. This is one of those kind of new templates that was spawned out of Murder. You now see this template being experimented with a lot of times. This is like if Murder is the 1 black, destroy target creature instant template, then the exile one is 3 and a black instant exile target creature. And that's what we have these kind of spin-off out of what you might call the Murder coaching tree. Gravkill was a C+ level card. Again, adding a relevant type in spacecraft. There are obviously spacecraft all over the place, and a lot of times you were stationing them, but you kind of rarely in limited Edge of Eternities did you ever station them to the point where they became permanent creatures. A lot of times you just stationed them and turned on static abilities, and that was fine. Bumped this up to a C+ level card, a card you were happy to have in your deck, sometimes in multiples. Spider-Man, we had Venom's Hunger, which was 4 and a black, so 2 extra mana. We've seen that's kind of rare, and the last time we saw it in early winter did not perform well. This is still just destroy target creature, but you gain 2 life, and we've saw how incidental life gain was really good, often bumps you up a couple of grades by itself. And it costs 2 less to cast if you control a villain. And in Spider-Man, if you were playing black as one of your primary colors, you had villains everywhere. So 2 extra mana, but it was rare that you actually had to pay 2 extra mana. Sorcery speed, that was a factor, but that was more than balanced by life gain. This was a B- level card. Performed great, made every deck it was in better. 5th best common in the set, even in a small set. Super good. And the community recognized that and drafted it accordingly. Avatar: The Last Airbender, we had sold out, which was 3 and a black instant exile target creature. There's that spin-off template we were talking about. And the extra text was, if it was dealt damage this turn, create a clue token. Now that's really weird extra cardboard card text, right? Because you don't usually want to destroy or exile a creature that's taken damage. It kind of defeats the purpose. You'd like to just clean remove something. But despite that, it was still worth the +1 mana. I suspect that most of the value of this card was just 3 and a black exile target creature. But every once in a while you'd get a clue token. Basically that changed how you wanted to play this card. You often wanted to play it to try to blow out a combat. And sometimes you would use it just, hey, I need to draw an extra card, so I'm going to chump block your creature. I was planning on removing it anyway, but I'll chump block, and basically I'm turning my 1/1 chump blocker into a clue token, kind of. Backdoor way of doing that. It performed fine. It was still the number 1 black common, despite being kind of a boring 4-mana removal spell. It was the number 1 black common and the number 12 common in the set. Lorwyn Eclipsed, we had Bog Slither's Embrace. Kind of a backwards version of the Dragon's Prey card. Dragon's Prey was more expensive if you targeted dragons. This is the cheapest version of Murder that we're going to see today. The cost listed on the card is just 1 and a black. It is a sorcery, but you had to pay an additional cost. You either had to blight 1, put a -1/-1 counter on one of your creatures, or pay 3 additional mana. It's kind of like merging Murder and Bone Splinters. It's probably more of a Bone Splinters, Bone Shards variant than it is a Murder variant. But the Blight 1 allowed you to play it for cheap, and it performed as a C+ level card. It performs slightly better than Murder. So there are lots of levers being pulled here. We're going to remove 1 black pip. We're going to make it sorcery speed. We're going to make you pay one of these costs. The optionality of costs was fine. Made every deck that it was in better. Was the 11th best common in the whole set. 3rd best in black. Played fine. You were often happy to have a couple of copies. In Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, we had Anchovy and Banana Pizza. This was kind of similar to Bake Into a Pie. I'm not surprised because it was like a food type of card. 2 black, so 1 more mana than murder. It was an artifact. This is the first version of murder that was an artifact. So it was like Bake Into a Pie, except instead of creating an additional food, so creating an additional piece of cardboard, it itself was the cardboard. So you played it. When it entered, you destroyed target creature, and then you could tap and sack it later for 2 to gain 3 life. But because it was an artifact, it was sorcery speed. And you also didn't get an extra object, you only got this object. And that let you play shenanigans like you can't typically get murder back from a graveyard by playing a card that's like return target permanent to your hand. Because, often murder is an instant or a sorcery most of the time, or the murder variant is an instant or a sorcery. Here you could get this back because it was a permanent, but this just played at the sea level. This was a full grade level worse than Bake Into a Pie. That shows you the difference between those two kinds of templating. It made some decks better. Particularly, it made white-black a lot worse. And that was because you did not want to be dirtling around with expensive removal spells and playing long games and gaining life in white-black, because white-black was one of the best color pairs in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and it wanted to be playing ninjas and attacking quickly and picking things up and having ninjas sneak attack people and stuff like that. I want to emphasize again, I'm going back to Bog Slither's Embrace here for a minute, performed very well, and we had murder performing well in several formats. Anchovy and Banana Pizza was the #1 most highly drafted common in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and the 21st best common. It was quite a bit overrated. Again, it was a fine removal spell, but not something you need to be drafting as the best common in the set. Secrets of Strixhaven, we had 2 versions, one in black and one as a black-green gold card. We had Wander Off and Grapple with Death. So Wander Off was the new Exile for 4 mana template. It is the most vanilla version of that. 3 and a black, exile target creature. And guess what? It played like murder. 55% C, like right in the middle. That's where murder usually ends up too. So it's slightly different templating. It costs 1 more mana. It only costs 1 black pip. It exiles instead of destroys. Just fine. Perfectly fine removal spell. Grapple with Death was 1 black-green, so kind of like 1 black-black as a gold card. Sorcery speed. Destroy target artifact or creature. Usually that was creature. Occasionally artifact would be relevant. And you gain 1 life. So you can call it Gold Murder with life gain, and that was enough to make it a little bit better than Wander Off. This card was underrated in the format for a long time, and part of it was because the Witherbloom colors, black-green in Secrets of Strixhaven, were being overdrafted and therefore underperforming for a while. But Grapple with Death held its own throughout the whole format, and actually, despite only having 1 colorless mana in its cost, it was a very splashable card. And because it was unconditional removal, you didn't mind not being able to play it on turn 3. You were happy to play it later. And it performed just fine. Did better than Wander Off did. The sorcery speed didn't hurt it. The gaining 1 life mattered, especially if you happen to be in Witherbloom colors. And that brings us to our most recent set. We've already talked about Hour of Defeat a little bit from Marvel Superheroes. It performed at the C+ level, slightly better than Murder. 3 and a black, instant, destroy target creatures, surveil 1. Even surveil 1 was worth the 1 extra mana. And also, probably more importantly, to give it the slight bump in grade here, was the fact that it was flexible in casting. Even though it cost 1 more mana than Murder does, the single black pip meant that this card, especially later in the format, often got splashed when people were desperate for removal to remove some of the big heroes and villains that populated the battlefield in Marvel Superheroes. And that brings us to the Murder variant that we are going to be seeing this weekend as we pre-release for the new set, The Hobbit. It is literally Murder with a different name. Bilbo's Deadly Slice, 1 black instant, destroy target creature. So it's got a different name and some different flavor text to fit in the particular Middle-earth universe there, but it's literally murder with a different name. This is not hard to grade. We should expect this to be a C-level card. The one thing that I will say is that the creature sizing in this set is really interesting. If you have not seen it already, go and find Sierkiewicz's thread on X or Twitter or on Blue Sky, and I'll refer you to his excellent Magic Numbers podcast as well. But he's pointed out that the creature sizing is pretty unprecedented in The Hobbit. There's a zillion X2s running around, 2 toughness creatures. There's not very many X3s and X4s, 3 and 4 toughness creatures. And then you start seeing some more at 5 toughness, which means you have what he calls a U-shaped curve. You're going to have a lot of decks that have lots of 2s, not very many 3s and 4s, and then lots of 5s. So that talks about play patterns with this card. And we'll get to that here as we get to the bottom of our takeaways. So Murder and its cousins. You can pretty much count on Murder being a 55% C-level card. It is the definition of a limited staple. Right in the middle, perfectly functional card. You probably don't want 5 of them. You're happy to have 1 or 2. They do a job, and they do it well. Extra cardboard and incidental life gain are the big bonuses. Those are the kinds of things that push Murder to be a top overall common. So if you see those things, Murder coming with an extra piece of cardboard, not itself a piece of cardboard, not it's an enchantment or it's an artifact, but creating an extra one like a Wicked Roll or a food token or something like that. If we get a Murder variant that like creates a treasure, I mean, that I think is going to be really good because then it's going to help you fix in black. But if you see extra cardboard being created by your Murder variant or incidental life gain, bump it up significantly, like a couple of grades from its typical C level. It's going to be a B level card at that point. Smaller bonuses come from exiling rather than destroying. And right now, Wizards has basically said that's worth an extra mana to do that. That's the 3 and a black exile template. And targeting another relevant type. If you get a type that's really plentiful in a set, and it says like exile target creature or that thing like vehicle or spacecraft, that usually bumps it up, maybe from C to C plus or something. And lastly, the creature sizing in The Hobbit, as I was saying. So if you have a bunch of 2 toughness creatures in The Hobbit, there's a lot of them, like more than normal. And there's, by the way, not very much removal that intentionally kills small things. We don't have like Widow's Bites running around from Marvel that gives -2/-2 to a 2 toughness creature. That doesn't exist in The Hobbit. As some templating is going to be lost in a small set. You're just not going to have certain kinds of cards. And so try to trade up with Bilbo's Deadly Sting if possible. It's a 3-mana card. Yes, sometimes you're going to have to use it on a pesky 2-drop, but try to hold that card to use against some of the bigger stuff that's going to be coming. You want it to be impactful. And so what I'm saying is you want to do more creature trading, I think, with the small stuff. And you want to save cards like Bilbo's Deadly Sting for some of the bigger stuff. That would be my initial advice going into pre-release weekend. We will see how it plays out. So thank you very much for being with us today, either on audio or video. New episodes every Friday. Next week's episode will be the first Pack 1, Pick 1 Limited Principles episode for The Hobbit. We'll see what happens when I start to play with the cards and see what the interesting build-arounds are. Subscribe, like, comment, join us, buy me a coffee if you wish. Thanks very much, and we'll see you next time for Limited Principles.